The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was, as far as Hazel Gentry was concerned, the most inconvenient day of the week to have your entire life rearranged. She read it standing in the narrow hallway of her aunt's house in Cincinnati, Ohio, still wearing her apron from the morning's bread baking, flour dusting her left wrist like a pale bracelet. The words were brief and blunt in the way that telegrams always were, stripped of sentiment by the cost of each character, and yet they managed to convey the full and irrevocable weight of what had happened. Her father, Edmund Gentry, had died of a fever at his homestead claim outside the town of Caldwell, Kansas. The year was 1878, and the frontier was still very much the kind of place where a man could work himself half to death and then let a fever finish the job. She set the telegram on the hall table beside a ceramic vase of dried lavender and stood very still for a long moment, listening to the tick of the grandfather clock at the end of the hall. Then she untied her apron, folded it over the banister, and went to find her aunt. Her father had staked his homestead claim 3 years prior, after her mother passed. He had written her letters every few weeks, letters full of wide sky descriptions and the smell of prairie grass and the particular quality of silence that existed out there in a way that Cincinnati simply could not replicate. He had spoken of the land as if it were a living thing, something that breathed and shifted and required tending. He had never once suggested she come join him, and she had never once asked to, and now he was dead and the land was hers because she was his only living child, and the question of what to do with it was pressing in on her from all sides. Her Aunt Dorothea, a woman of 52 with strong opinions and equally strong coffee, sat across from her at the kitchen table and said what she felt needed to be said, which was that a young woman of 24 had no business traveling alone to the Kansas frontier to manage a homestead claim in the middle of nowhere. There were perfectly good lawyers who handled these things. The land could be sold. She could stay in Cincinnati, where there were decent people and paved roads and a very respectable lending library on Elm Street. Hazel listened to all of this with the patient expression of someone who had already made up her mind. She had always been a practical woman, but she was also her father's daughter in ways that ran deeper than temperament. Edmund Gentry had believed in the value of seeing things with your own eyes. He had believed that the world rewarded people who showed up. He had written to her once about a sunrise over the prairie that had made him understand, for the first time in his life, why some people talked about God the way they did. She had read that letter 4 times, and then she had pressed it between the pages of her Bible, and she had kept it there ever since. She would go to Kansas. She would see the land. She would decide what to do with it after she had stood on it and understood what it was. The train ride from Cincinnati to Caldwell took 3 days and involved 2 transfers, a broken axle on the second leg that delayed everything by 6 hours, and a thunderstorm somewhere in Missouri that turned the sky a color that Hazel had never seen before, a kind of bruised purple-green that pressed down on the flat land like a hand. She sat with her face close to the rain-streaked window and watched it, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. She arrived in Caldwell in the early afternoon of a Thursday in late April, stepping off the train into air that smelled like dust and horses, and something faintly sweet that she would later learn was the prairie grass itself, just beginning to green up after the winter. The town was small and functional in the way that frontier towns were, built for purpose rather than beauty, but it had a kind of raw energy to it that Cincinnati, for all its civility, entirely lacked. Men moved with deliberate efficiency along the main street. A woman in a blue calico dress stood outside the general store with a child on her hip, squinting into the afternoon sun. 2 cowboys leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon with their hats tipped forward, apparently engaged in a deeply serious conversation about something invisible on the ground between them. Hazel collected her 2 trunks from the baggage car, arranged for them to be held at the station, and went to find the land office to confirm the deed transfer for her father's claim. The land office was a small building with a crooked sign above the door, and a man inside who was reading a newspaper with the concentration of someone who was not interested in being interrupted. He was interrupted anyway. Hazel laid her documents on the counter and explained her situation in clear, complete sentences, and the man, whose name she never caught because he did not offer it, processed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had seen this particular kind of story before. Homesteader dies. Family comes to collect. Land changes hands or gets sold. He stamped the deed transfer documents and handed her a copy, and told her the claim was 40 acres, northeast of town. Follow the creek bed for about 2 miles, and you'll see the fencing. She thanked him and went back out into the afternoon sun. It was there, standing on the wooden sidewalk outside the land office with her documents in hand, that she became aware of the problem she had not fully accounted for. She had no horse. She had no wagon. She had no idea how to get to a homestead claim 40 acres in size that was 2 miles outside of town by way of a creek bed. She had arrived expecting wilderness and found instead a practical logistical challenge, which was, in some ways, worse. She was standing there working through her options, which at present numbered 2, being hire a horse from the livery and figure out the riding on her own, or find someone who knew the land and would take her out to the property, when a voice to her left said, "You look like you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't have a clean answer." She turned. He was leaning against the wall of the adjacent building with one boot crossed over the other, and his hat pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had recently been moving fast and had not gotten around to resettling it properly. He was tall, somewhere in the vicinity of 30, with dark hair that was a little too long at the collar, and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in what appeared to be several days. His clothes were clean, but had the rumpled, lived-in quality of a man who did not much think about his clothes, except when there was a specific reason to. His eyes were a steady, attentive brown, and he was looking at her with an expression that was curious without being intrusive. "I was trying to find my father's homestead claim," she said, because she was a direct person and did not see the point in being otherwise. 2 miles northeast, follow the creek. I don't have a horse." "Edmund Gentry's claim," he said. She looked at him more carefully. "You knew my father." Something moved across his face, a small and genuine thing. "Yes, ma'am, Roy Cooper. I had the claim adjacent to your father's to the south. We shared a fence line and a fair amount of conversation over the last 3 years. He straightened from the wall and touched the brim of his hat. "I heard about his passing. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said. "I'm Hazel Gentry." "I know," he said. "He talked about you." This surprised her, though she was not sure it should have. She had imagined her father out there on the prairie living a self-contained life, the letters his only connection back to the world he had left. The idea that she had existed as a presence in his conversations with his neighbors made her chest do the tightening thing again, and she looked away briefly toward the main street, where a wagon loaded with fence posts was rattling past. "What did he say?" she asked. Roy Cooper considered this with the careful expression of a man choosing his words deliberately. "He said you had good sense and a stubborn streak, and that you made the best apple cake he'd ever eaten. He said he wished he had asked you to come out sooner." He paused. "He said he kept thinking he'd get the place more settled first so it would be worth your while. He was always working on something out there." She turned back to him. There was an honesty in the way he said it that she found immediately disarming. "I'd like to see it," she said. "The claim, if you were going that way." "I was going that way," he said, and she had the sense this was not entirely true but that he was willing to make it true, which was a different and more interesting thing. He brought his horse around from the livery, a solid bay named Thomas who did not care about Hazel one way or another, and she rode behind him on the way out, holding the back of the saddle with both hands and trying not to seem like a woman who had never sat on a horse in her life, which she was, almost exactly. Roy Cooper did not comment on this. He rode with an easy familiarity with the animal, and they moved out of town along the creek bed at a pace that was comfortable without being slow. The land opened up around her in a way that she had not been prepared for. She had expected the prairie to feel like absence, like the absence of the hills and trees and defined horizons of Ohio. Instead, it felt like presence. The sky was enormous in a way that was almost physical, a great dome of blue that came down to meet the flat earth on every side, and the grass, just greening up after the winter, moved in long, slow waves that were more like water than like land. There were birds she did not recognize calling from somewhere invisible. The air was dry and warm and smelled like earth and green things in distance. She did not say any of this out loud. She sat on the horse behind Roy Cooper and looked at the world her father had chosen and felt something she could not quite name settling into her bones. The claim, when they reached it, was 40 acres of prairie grass with a small creek running along the eastern edge, a kitchen garden that had been turned and was waiting for seed, and a house that was, she would later describe to her Aunt Dorothea in a letter, the most aggressively earnest building she had ever seen. Her father had built it himself, which was evident. It was a single-story wooden structure with a porch that leaned slightly to the left, and a chimney that had been rebuilt at least once by someone who had figured out the technique halfway through. The interior, when they pushed open the door, was clean in the way that a man's space is clean when the man has made some effort, not spotless, but intentional. There was a table and 2 chairs and a stove and a rope bed in the corner with a quilt folded over it, and on the shelf above the stove there were 4 books and a tin of coffee, and a small framed photograph that turned out to be a photograph of her mother, taken before Hazel was born, when her mother was still a young woman with dark eyes and a half-smile that Hazel had inherited exactly. She stood looking at the photograph for a long time. Roy Cooper waited outside on the porch. She heard him moving around out there, checking things she could not see, and she was grateful for the space. When she came back out, she stood on the leaning porch and looked out across the claim in the late afternoon light, which was turning everything gold in that particular way it had out here, as if the sun was taking its time about leaving. "What's the condition of the soil?" she asked. Roy Cooper, who was crouched by the porch steps examining where one of the supports had started to give, looked up. He had not expected that question, she could tell, but he answered it without hesitation. "Good," he said. "Your father had been working it for 3 years. He had winter wheat in the south field last year. The garden's been turned. Creek gives you water on the east side. It's a good claim." "Can it support a living?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "With work, yes," he said. "It's not easy country. Nothing out here is, but it's possible." She nodded slowly. "I'm going to stay," she said, and she said it as much to the land as to him, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised even her. "I didn't come all this way to sell my father's work to a stranger." Roy Cooper looked at her for a long moment from beneath the brim of his hat, and then he nodded once, as if he had been waiting for exactly that answer. "You'll need supplies," he said. "The claim's been sitting empty 3 weeks, and that porch support is going to need fixing before it takes someone's ankle." "I'll need a lot of things," she said. "I'll figure them out in order." The first week was an education in the particular demands of frontier living that no amount of letter reading had fully prepared her for, the well-needed priming. The stove had a temperamental flue that either drew perfectly or not at all, apparently based on the wind direction, which changed daily. The kitchen garden needed to be properly turned again and planted before the window for spring crops closed. She needed to understand which of her father's tools worked and which were in need of repair, and she needed to do all of this while also learning the rhythms of a landscape that was entirely foreign to her. Roy Cooper appeared on the second morning with a bag of flour, a side of salt pork, and the casual manner of someone who had just been passing by and happened to have these things, which was not precisely true but was a kind offer regardless. He showed her how to prime the well properly, how to stack the wood so it would dry correctly, and how to read the weather by watching the way the grass moved, which she found fascinating in a way she did not entirely understand at the time. He had a directness to him that she appreciated. He did not talk down to her or treat her as someone requiring rescue. He answered her questions completely and without condescension, and when she said she had done something herself, he accepted it as a statement of fact and did not feel the need to verify it. This was a quality that she had encountered rarely enough in men that she noticed it clearly. His own claim to the south of hers was considerably more established than her father's. He had been homesteading for 4 years, arriving in 1874, and the house he had built was a proper 2-room structure with a real stone foundation, and a barn that actually looked like a barn was supposed to look. He kept 6 horses and a small herd of cattle and grew winter wheat on the north field. He was a methodical man, organized in his work in a way that was evident in how everything on his property had a place and a purpose. Hazel, being a practical observer, noticed these things the first time he brought her over to show her how to examine the teeth of a horse she was considering purchasing from a rancher in town. She noticed that the barn was swept. She noticed that the tools on the wall were hung in a specific order, largest to smallest, and that the order had been maintained consistently enough that the outlines of the tools were visible on the wall behind them from years of hanging in exactly the same spot. She noticed that the house, which she could see through the open door from where they stood in the yard, was organized but spare in a way that spoke not of tidiness exactly, but of a man who had been living alone for a long time and had arranged things for pure function. She did not say anything about any of this, but she filed it away. The Caldwell townspeople were welcoming in the practical, direct manner of people who understood that community was a survival strategy rather than a social nicety. Mrs. Ida Wellborn at the general store extended her credit when she explained the situation with her father's claim, and gave her several pieces of advice about planting timing that turned out to be extremely useful. The doctor, a compact red-haired man named Dr. Fenwick, who had come out from St. Louis in 1875, told her that Edmund Gentry had been a good man and a good neighbor, and that the county would miss him. The sheriff, whose name was Harlan Walsh, was a quiet man of about 50 who nodded at her from across the street in a way that she took as acknowledgement and welcome both. She was aware, in those first weeks, that people in town were watching the developing neighborly relationship between her and Roy Cooper with a kind of interested attention that was not quite gossip, but was adjacent to it. In a small frontier town in 1878, a young unmarried woman and a young unmarried man who were adjacent neighbors with a shared fence line were a subject of natural interest. She found she did not particularly mind it, because there was nothing in the interest that was unkind, only curious. What she did think about, in the evenings when the day's work was done and she sat on her leaning porch watching the last of the light leave the sky, was what she actually knew about Roy Cooper after 3 weeks of daily proximity. She knew that he was 31 years old, that he had come to Kansas from Tennessee where he had grown up on a farm. She knew that he had been in the cattle business before homesteading, had done 2 cattle drives up from Texas along the Kishom Trail before deciding that permanent land was what he actually wanted. She knew that he had been educated enough to discuss the books on her father's shelf with genuine engagement, and that he had opinions about the Reconstruction, and about the railroad expansion, and about the treatment of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had been forcibly removed from this land to make room for settlers like themselves. Opinions that were more nuanced and more troubled than she had expected from a man in his position, and which she found herself returning to in her own thinking afterward. She knew that he laughed rarely, but when he did it was sudden and full, and entirely genuine. She knew that he worked from before dawn until after dark without complaint or self-congratulation, that he helped his neighbors without being asked and without keeping score, and that he had a border collie named Pearl who followed him everywhere and who, after the 3rd or 4th of his visits to her claim, began following Hazel as well, which Roy Cooper found quietly amusing in a way he did not explain. She also knew, because she was observant and honest with herself, that she had begun to look for his horse on the horizon in the mornings, and that the days when he did not come by felt different from the days when he did. She knew this, and she turned it over carefully in her mind, the way she turned over soil to see what was underneath. 3 weeks after she arrived, there was a storm. It came in fast from the northwest in the middle of the afternoon, the sky going from clear to that bruised green-purple color she had first seen from the train window, and the wind picking up with a speed and intention that was genuinely alarming. Roy Cooper arrived at her claim at a hard gallop before she had fully understood what was happening, pulling Thomas up short in the yard and dropping off the horse in a single motion that spoke of urgency. "Tornado weather," he said. "You need to get into the root cellar." "Do you know where it is?" She did know where it was because she had made a point of learning everything about the property in her first week. "Around the back of the house," she said. "Go now," he said. "I'll get the animals." The root cellar was dug into the earth behind the house, a shallow cave of it with a heavy wooden door that she had to pull against the wind that was already rising in a way that felt personal, as if it had an opinion about her specifically. She got the door open and went down the packed earth steps into the cool dark and pulled the door shut above her just as the first sound of the tornado reached her, a low rolling pressure that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She sat in the dark on the dirt floor with her knees pulled up and listened to the world outside rearrange itself. The noise was enormous, and then it was not, passing like something alive. And then there was the secondary sound of things settling, and the rain arriving hard and straight and cold against the cellar door. The door opened from above, and Roy Cooper came down the steps with mud on his boots and rain on his hat, pulling the door shut behind him and sitting down on the floor beside her with his back against the earth wall. He had Pearl with him, the border collie pressing immediately against Hazel's legs with the businesslike practicality of a dog who considered comfort a reasonable goal in a crisis. "Animals are in the barn," he said. "Your fence is going to need work on the north side." "Did it come close?" she asked. "Close enough to be interesting," he said. "Missed the house." They sat in the root cellar together in the dark while the rain continued above them, and Hazel became aware of the particular quality of sitting in a small dark space with a person you have been spending a great deal of time thinking about. She was very aware of the width of his shoulders and the steadiness of his breathing, and the fact that he had ridden over at a gallop the moment he saw the weather coming to make sure she knew what to do. "You didn't have to come," she said. "You have your own property." "Your father would have expected it," he said. Then, a beat later, "And I would have done it regardless." The rain continued. Pearl fell asleep with her head on Hazel's knee. "Roy," she said, trying out the use of his given name, which she had been careful to avoid up to this point. "What made you stay out here, on the claim? What made you decide this was where you wanted to be?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought perhaps she had asked a question he did not want to answer. But then he said, "The first winter was bad. Second one was worse. I lost cattle. I lost fence. There were months where I thought about leaving." He turned his hat over in his hands. "But I'd walk out in the morning and look at the land and think, this is mine. Not because I paid for it, though I did, but because I put my work into it, because I know every inch of it. There's something in that I couldn't leave." He paused. "Also, I'd promised myself I'd do a thing, and I don't like not finishing what I've started." "My father said something similar," she said, "in his letters." "Your father was a good man," he said, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that made her throat tight. The rain began to ease. The quality of the light through the gaps in the cellar door shifted from gray to gold, and Hazel became aware that they had been sitting in the root cellar for something over an hour, and that there was nothing particularly uncomfortable about this, which told her something about the state of things. "We should go see what needs fixing," she said. "We should," he agreed, but neither of them moved for another minute, and Pearl did not lift her head from Hazel's knee, and the last of the rain tapped down on the cellar door like something saying goodbye. The fence on the north side of the property needed a full day's work to repair. Roy brought post materials from his own supply without being asked, arriving the next morning with the lumber in the wagon and Thomas and his other horse, a tall gray named Elias, both in harness, and together they worked through the morning and into the afternoon fixing the line. Working alongside him was easy in a way that surprised her. He did not issue instructions. He worked and she worked, and when her technique was wrong, he showed her the correct way once without comment and did not mention it again when she improved. By midday she was setting posts with a competence that genuinely pleased her, the physical work satisfying in its directness. You hammered a thing, the thing was hammered. The fence was either fixed or it was not. She began to understand, working beside him, why her father had found such satisfaction out here. The thing that happened gradually over the next 6 weeks was a domestic education that Hazel had not anticipated. She had expected to be learning to survive the land. What she found herself learning instead were the particular ways that two people who live adjacent to one another on the frontier begin to weave their lives together by pure practical necessity, and how it is sometimes very difficult to identify the exact point at which practical necessity gives way to something else. He fixed her porch. This happened on a Sunday afternoon in early May, when she was at her kitchen table working through her father's accounts, trying to understand what debts remained and what resources she had to work with. She heard hammering from the porch and went to the door and found Roy Cooper replacing the rotten support with a new piece of timber he had cut and shaped at his own place, Pearl watching him with focused attention from the yard. "You don't have to do that," she said. "It was going to give way," he said. "Someone was going to fall." She leaned in the doorway and watched him work. His hands were very capable. She had noticed this several times before and was by now accustomed to noticing it. "Roy," she said, "I want to be clear that I'm capable of managing this claim myself." He looked up at her with an expression that was, she thought, somewhere between amused and genuinely earnest. "I know that," he said. "I never thought otherwise." "Then why," she asked, and she said it without accusation, only genuine curiosity, "do you keep coming over here and fixing things?" He sat back on his heels and looked at her for a moment. "Because I want to," he said. "Because it's the right thing to do for a neighbor, and because," he stopped and something moved across his face that she could not quite read. He picked up another nail and turned back to the support beam. "Because your father told me, a couple months before he passed, that he thought you might come out someday and that he hoped someone would look out for the place until you got your footing." She was quiet for a moment. "He said that. He worried about you coming out here and not having anyone." He set the nail and drove it home with 3 clean strokes. He was a man who paid attention to the people he loved. She looked away from him, across the yard to where the prairie grass was moving in its slow waterway, and felt the grief of her father's loss with a particular sharpness that had something to do with how well Roy Cooper had known him and how much that mattered to her. The first time she told him something personal was on a Wednesday evening in early June, when she had walked the fence line to the southern boundary of her property, and found herself on the shared fence line between her claim and his, where the creek made a curve and there was a cottonwood tree that was enormously old by prairie standards, and Roy Cooper was already there, sitting with his back against the cottonwood and reading a book in the last of the evening light. She sat down on the opposite side of the tree, and they did not make a production of it, because by now they were comfortable enough with each other's company that sitting together under a cottonwood tree required no particular justification. "I was going to be married," she said after a while. It came out with the ease of something she had been carrying a long time and was ready to set down. "In Cincinnati, 3 years ago. He was a very proper, very correct man who was in business with my uncle. We were engaged for 6 months. And then he decided that I had too many opinions about too many things, and that this was not going to make for an easy life." Roy Cooper did not say anything immediately. He turned a page of his book and then closed it. "His loss," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was. At the time it felt like mine. Now it feels like I had a narrow escape from something very dull. She looked at the creek moving quietly over its stones. I think I might have been waiting for something I couldn't name. I think I might have been waiting to know what I actually wanted before I agreed to anything permanent. He was looking at her with that steady brown gaze that she had become familiar with, the one that did not demand anything from her but missed nothing. "And do you know," he asked, "what you want?" She met his eyes and held them for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than a purely comfortable silence required. "I'm starting to understand it," she said. They walked back along the fence line in the last of the evening light, not quite touching, Pearl trotting between them, and the sky above the prairie turned from gold to rose to the deep transparent blue that preceded the stars, and Hazel Gentry understood that she was in serious trouble in the very best possible way. The first thing she noticed, arriving at his property the following Saturday with 3 jars of the plum preserves she had made from the plum trees at the creek's edge, was that something was different. She could not identify it immediately. She came through the gate and across the yard toward the house, where the door was open to the June morning, and Roy Cooper came out onto the porch to meet her with a look that was, she would later think, almost transparently self-conscious, which was not an expression she had previously seen on his face. He was wearing a clean shirt. This was not unusual. But his hair was combed and he had shaved, both of which were somewhat more notable on a Saturday morning when there was no evident reason for them. She noticed. She did not say anything. She handed him the preserves and complimented his fence work on the south pasture, which she had passed on the way, and accepted the cup of coffee he offered and went inside with him. And that was when she understood what had changed. The house was tidied, not cleaned in any extreme or unfamiliar way, but tidied with the specific kind of effort that a person makes when they want a space to show well. The books on the shelf were straightened. The table had been cleared of the various pieces of hardware and harness that usually occupied half of it. The floor had been swept. There was a blue pottery mug on the table with a handful of prairie wildflowers in it, the small yellow ones that grew along the creek in June, and she had to look at this for a moment before she could be sure she was reading it correctly. Prairie wildflowers in a blue pottery mug, placed on a table that had been cleared specifically, in a house where the man who lived in it had shaved and combed his hair on a Saturday morning. She looked up from the mug to find Roy Cooper watching her with an expression that was the most unguarded she had ever seen on him, something careful and hoping, and not entirely sure of itself, entirely at odds with the composed, capable manner she had come to know. She set her coffee cup down. "Roy," she said. "Hazel," he said. "Did you put those flowers there because you knew I was coming?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "Have you been tidying the house before I come by?" Another pause, slightly shorter. "Some." She felt something warm and impossible beginning to move through her chest. She looked at him across the table with its cleared surface and its pottery mug of yellow wildflowers and said, "How long?" He rubbed the back of his neck in a gesture she had learned was his tell for discomfort or embarrassment or both. "Since about the 3rd week," he said. "Since about the 3rd day you were here, truthfully, but I didn't start acting on it until the 3rd week because I was trying to be sensible about it." She felt a sound move through her that was close to a laugh but deeper. "I have been looking for your horse on the horizon every morning since the 2nd week," she said. He looked at her. "I have been thinking about you," she continued, because she was a direct person and she had decided to stop pretending otherwise. "Almost continuously since you showed me how to prime the well and told me that my father had talked about me and that he wished he had asked me to come sooner. I have been trying to be sensible about it too." Roy Cooper crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her hands in his, and she could feel that his hands were not quite steady, which moved her more than almost anything else could have. "Hazel Gentry," he said, "I would like very much to court you properly if you're willing. I know this is fast and you've had a great deal change in a short time, and I don't want to push for anything you're not ready for. but I would like to be honest with you because I don't know any other way to be, and I think you deserve honesty." "I appreciate honesty above most things," she said, "and I am very willing." He smiled then, the real smile, the one she had seen only a handful of times, sudden and full and entirely genuine, and it changed his whole face in a way that she felt in her chest like a door opening. He kissed her hand with a formality that was both sweet and earnest, and she thought of her father writing her letters about the wide sky, and the prairie silence, and the sunrises that made him understand why people talked about God. And she thought perhaps Edmund Gentry had known something about this land that she was only just beginning to understand. The courtship, such as it was in the practical conditions of frontier Kansas in the summer of 1878, looked different from courtship in Cincinnati. There were no parlor calls or formal dinners or chaperones. There was instead a great deal of time spent working side by side on the adjacent claims, which merged organically into shared meals and long evenings on the porch watching the enormous sky do its extraordinary things, and conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical in a way that she found deeply satisfying. She learned things about him that she could not have learned in any other way. She learned that he had a younger brother in Tennessee named Franklin, whom he wrote to every month, and worried about in the quiet way that older brothers worry about younger ones from a distance. She learned that he had been profoundly affected by what he had seen, and heard about the forced removal of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples from these very lands to reservations in Indian Territory, and that he carried a specific discomfort about his own homestead claim being built on land that had been taken from people who had lived on it for generations. A discomfort he did not try to resolve with easy justifications, but simply held honestly. She appreciated this about him, the willingness to hold the complicated truth of a thing without requiring it to be simpler than it was. She learned that he could not carry a tune in any recognizable way, but that he knew a great many songs and was willing to sing them anyway badly, on evenings when the work was done and the sky was full of stars, and that this was somehow the most endearing thing about him. She learned that he could fix almost anything mechanical, and that he was genuinely stumped by sourdough bread, which he had been attempting for 2 years with consistent failure, and she taught him the technique on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in her kitchen, and they ate the results warm from the oven with the plum preserves, and it was, she would later think, one of the most purely happy hours of her life. He took her into Caldwell on a Sunday in July, both of them on horseback, for the church service that most of the surrounding homesteaders attended when they could make it in. Sitting beside him in the small whitewashed church building with the congregation of farmers and merchants and their families, the preacher's voice filling the space with something about the permanence of the land and the value of community, she felt a sense of rightness that settled into her like warmth. Mrs. Ida Wellborn from the general store caught her eye across the aisle and gave her a look of such warm approval that Hazel had to suppress a smile. Caldwell had, it was clear, already formed opinions about what was developing between the woman on Edmund Gentry's claim and Roy Cooper from the adjacent property, and those opinions were uniformly positive. After the service, standing in the sunshine outside the church with the congregation milling around them, Roy Cooper introduced her formally to people he knew, and she noticed the way he did it, with a particular care, placing his hand briefly at the small of her back and saying her name with a quality in his voice that she recognized as pride, and she felt something turn over in her quietly, something permanent. They had their first disagreement on a hot afternoon in late July, which was good, she felt, because it told her something important about the nature of the thing between them. A man named Garrett Holt had come by her claim, offering to buy the eastern 40 acres at what he presented as a generous price, but which Hazel had done enough calculation to understand was approximately 60% of the land's actual value. She had declined politely but firmly, and Garrett Holt had persisted in a way that had gone from insistent to something she found unpleasant, questioning whether she truly understood land values and whether she had anyone helping her make decisions. When Roy Cooper came by that evening and she told him about it, he was immediately ready to go have a conversation with Garrett Holt, and she said, quite directly, that she did not need him to have any conversations with anyone on her behalf, that she had handled it and it was handled, and that if it came up again she was capable of handling it again. He stopped. He looked at her. And then he said, "You're right. I'm sorry. I jumped to protecting you without thinking about whether you needed protecting." She looked at him for a moment. "I did appreciate the impulse," she said. "I just don't need the action." "Understood," he said, and that was the end of it. She thought about this exchange for several days afterward. A man who could hear a correction and receive it without resentment or defensiveness was, in her experience, not common. She turned this over in her mind the way she turned over all of the things she was learning about Roy Cooper, and each thing she turned over added to the certainty that was building in her slowly and steadily like water rising. In August, she wrote a letter to her Aunt Dorothea in Cincinnati. She described the claim and the work and the community she had found in Caldwell, and she described Roy Cooper with the particular careful honesty of someone who is writing to a person who will read between every line regardless. She said that she had found something she had not known she was looking for, and that the wilderness she had expected to find had turned out to be something else entirely, something more like home. Her Aunt Dorothea wrote back in September. The letter was long and typically direct, and included 3 specific questions about Roy Cooper's financial situation, his family background, and his general character, which Hazel answered in detail in her next letter. She also mentioned that his house was clean and organized, and that he had put wildflowers in a pottery mug for her, the first time she had come to visit with any expectation of it mattering. And her Aunt Dorothea, who was a woman who had been married for 26 years to a man who had never once brought her flowers of any description, wrote back that this was the most telling detail in the whole correspondence. The summer passed into fall in the way of the Kansas prairie, the grass going golden brown, the air sharpening, the evenings arriving earlier and carrying a cold that had nothing ambiguous about it. The harvest work was consuming in its demands, and the 2 claims functioned almost as one property for the duration of it, Roy and Hazel working from the early mornings to the late afternoons to get the crops in, and the root vegetables cellared, and the hay stacked, and everything done that needed doing before the winter came. Working together through the harvest, she understood something about him that she had been approaching from a distance for months. He was a man who had been building something out here on the Kansas prairie for 4 years, building a life with the same methodical care he brought to everything. And the thing he had been building had all the practical pieces in good order, the land and the stock and the structure of it, but had been missing, she thought, a center. Not because he was incomplete in himself, but because the thing he was building was the kind of thing that is built for more than one person, and he had been waiting, maybe without knowing precisely that he was waiting, for someone to build it with. She thought about what it meant that a man like Roy Cooper, serious and private and not given to easy expression, had started tidying his house when she began coming to visit. She thought about what it meant that he had put flowers on his table for her. These were small things, but she had learned that the small things were where the real information lived, and the information these things gave her was clear and consistent and made her feel, every time she thought about it, as if the enormous Kansas sky had found its way inside her chest. On an afternoon in October, walking along the shared fence line in the gold and brown light of the fall, she said to him, "Roy, I'm not going back to Cincinnati." He was walking beside her with Pearl at his heels, his hands in the pockets of his coat, and he turned to look at her with the careful expression she knew meant he was listening with all of his attention. "I want to be clear about that," she said. "Not because of anything practical, because this is where I want to be." He stopped walking. She stopped too, facing him in the October light with the wind moving through the dry grass around them. "Hazel," he said, and then he stopped, which was unusual for him. He took a breath. "I have been thinking about saying something to you for 3 months, and I have been trying to find the right moment, and I am now going to say it because I suspect there is no perfect moment and I should stop waiting for one." She looked at him and waited. "I love you," he said. He said it with the direct simplicity of a man who means exactly what he says. "I have loved you since probably the 3rd week you were here, though it took me a while to put a name to it. I love the way you think and the way you work and the way you argue and the way you learn things and the way you talk to Pearl like she's a person. I love that you stayed. I love that you looked at this land and decided it was worth something. I love you, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life in close proximity to you, if you are of a similar mind." The wind moved through the grass and a hawk circled high and slow above them in the pale October sky, and Hazel Gentry, who was a practical and direct woman, crossed the space between them and put her hands on either side of his face and said, "Roy Cooper, I love you too. I have loved you since you sang 3 verses of a completely unrecognizable song under the stars in August, and did not appear to notice or care that you couldn't carry the tune. I love you, and yes, I am very much of a similar mind." He kissed her then, properly and deliberately, his hands coming up to hold her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with how capable those hands were, and the October sun was warm on her back, and the hawk turned one more slow circle above them, and somewhere in the middle distance Pearl barked once at something in the grass and then was quiet. They were engaged by the end of October, and Hazel wrote to her Aunt Dorothea with the news, and received in return a letter that was equal parts congratulations and practical advice, along with the information that Dorothea intended to come out to Kansas in the spring, which Hazel was glad of. Roy proposed formally in the way he did everything that mattered, with care and specificity. He came to her claim on a Sunday morning in late October with Thomas in the yard and his hat in his hands, and said that he would like to do this properly, and produced from his coat pocket a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple band of gold with a small oval garnet set in it, which he had evidently been carrying for some time, based on the worn look of the velvet box it came in. He asked her to marry him with his steady brown eyes and his honest face, and she said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, and he put the ring on her finger and looked at it there with an expression that was so unguarded and so full that she had to hold herself very still for a moment to absorb the weight of it. "It fits," he said. "It does," she agreed. The wedding was planned for the spring, and the intervening winter was one of the best and worst of Hazel's life, which is the way of the best winters. It was hard in all the physical ways that prairie winters were hard: cold that came down like something alive and insistent, snow that could close a person in for days at a time, the work of keeping the animals alive and the pipes clear, and the wood supply adequate. But there was also the quality of light on snow that was unlike anything she had ever seen, and the silence of the prairie under winter conditions, which was a different and deeper silence than the summer one, and the evenings she spent at Roy's house, or he spent at hers by the stove with the wind outside and warmth inside, and the sustained particular pleasure of being in the company of a person you love and are loved by, which she was beginning to understand, was the best of all possible human conditions. They talked through the long evenings about everything, about the future of the claims, whether to work them independently or merge the operation more formally after the wedding, about the state of the Kansas cattle business and the encroachment of the barbed wire fences that were changing the open range dynamics across the territory, about his brother Franklin in Tennessee, who had written to say he was glad Roy had found someone and that he hoped to come visit someday, about what kind of life they wanted to build here on this land, what it could be at its best. She noticed that winter something she might have noticed sooner, which was the way the house changed when she was in it. Not just that it was tidier, though it was, but that it felt different, occupied in a fuller way, as if the rooms were glad to have her there. She had never thought of herself as someone who made spaces feel different simply by being in them. But something about the way Roy Cooper looked at her when she came through his door made her think that perhaps this was a thing that depended on who was in the room with you. She finished her father's accounts that winter and understood the full picture of the claim's financial situation. It was not without challenges. Her father had taken a small loan from the bank in Caldwell in his second year, which still carried a balance, and the first winter wheat crop from her fields would need to be good to make a meaningful payment against it. She was not worried exactly, but she was clear-eyed about what the coming season needed to produce, and she discussed it with Roy on an evening in January with the storm outside and the stove between them, laying out the numbers without drama. He listened to all of it and then said, "We can plant the south field on your claim with winter wheat this year and time it with mine. Better yield with the shared equipment and labor. The bank will work with you as long as they see the plan." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. He smiled. "I know," he said. "You'd already figured it out. You just wanted to see if I came to the same conclusion." She laughed. "I did," she admitted. "You did." In February, a letter arrived from Franklin Cooper in Tennessee, addressed to them both, which she found touching in a specific way. He wrote that Roy had written him about Hazel with a thoroughness and a warmth that made it clear his brother had finally found the person he had been too stubborn to admit he was looking for, and that he was glad for them both. He enclosed a small pressed flower from Tennessee, a violet, and wrote that it was his mother's tradition to send a violet with good news. She pressed the violet in her Bible beside her father's letter about the sunrise and the understanding of God. The wedding was in April of 1879, a year after she had arrived in Caldwell on the train with 2 trunks and no horse and no particular plan. The church was full, which surprised her somewhat because she had only been in Caldwell for a year, but the frontier community was a thing that formed around people who stayed and worked and showed up, and she had done all 3, and so had Roy, for years before she came. Mrs. Ida Wellborn had organized the women of the congregation to provide a wedding breakfast in the church hall after the service, and the tables were laden with things that Hazel recognized as the best of what each person had: pies and preserved things and fresh bread, and a cake that was 3 layers tall and took up the entire center of the main table. Dr. Fenwick gave a toast that was brief and warmly specific. Sheriff Walsh shook Roy's hand with the gravity of a man for whom handshakes were meaningful actions. Aunt Dorothea arrived from Cincinnati on the Thursday before the wedding, having written 3 increasingly emphatic letters about her intention to make the journey despite Hazel's assurances that she did not need to, and stood in Hazel's kitchen on the afternoon of her arrival, looking around at the evidence of the life her niece had built with an expression that moved through surprise and into something that Hazel recognized as approval. "You look well," Dorothea said. "I am well," Hazel said. "He seems capable," Dorothea said, nodding toward the yard where Roy was mending a harness with the focused competence that characterized all his physical work. "And genuinely good. Those are 2 separate things, and a woman does well to have both." "I know," Hazel said. Dorothea looked at her with the sharp, fond look that was her version of tenderness. "Your father would have been glad," she said. "I think he would have been enormously smug," Hazel said. "I think he would have said he arranged the whole thing." Dorothea laughed, a real laugh, the kind that creased her whole face. "He probably would have," she said. On the morning of the wedding, Hazel stood in her bedroom at the claim, the room where her father had slept, and she looked out the window at the April prairie, the grass coming back green again, the sky that particular transparent blue of early spring, and she felt her father's presence in the way you sometimes do when a moment is complete enough to hold the people who should have been in it. She wore a dress that she had made herself that winter, a blue-gray wool that was practical enough to be kept and worn again, and was, she thought, the exact right color for the April prairie light. Dorothea helped her with her hair and said that she looked like her mother, and Hazel held this observation carefully, the way you hold something you want to keep. Roy Cooper at the altar of the Caldwell Church was a version of Roy Cooper she had not quite seen before, though it was unmistakably him in every essential way. He was wearing a proper suit that fit him well, and he had combed his hair with evident care. And when he looked at her coming down the church aisle with Dorothea at her side, the expression on his face was so transparently everything that she stopped walking for a moment, just briefly, because it was necessary to absorb it properly. The vows were spoken in the simple, serious way of two people who meant every word of them. The ring, her grandmother's garnet ring, was already on her finger and had been since October, and the ceremony was less a beginning than a ratification of something already deeply true, a public acknowledgment of what the prairie and the adjacent claims and the cottonwood tree by the creek and the root cellar and a pottery mug of yellow wildflowers had already established. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Roy Cooper kissed her with a warmth and a sincerity that made several of the women in the congregation smile in the way people smile when they recognize something real. And Pearl, who had been brought in by someone and was sitting in the front pew with the appearance of a dog who felt she had earned her place there, let out a single satisfied bark that broke the solemnity in exactly the right way and made everyone laugh, including the preacher. The life that followed the wedding was, in the best possible sense, the ordinary and extraordinary life of two people building something together on a 40-acre claim on the Kansas prairie in the late 1870s. It was hard in all the ways that frontier life was hard, and rich in all the ways that a life can be rich when you are doing work that matters alongside a person you love deeply. They merged the farm operations formally that spring, working Roy's claim and Hazel's as a single enterprise with shared equipment and shared labor and shared decision-making. The winter wheat came in strong that summer, strong enough to make a substantial payment on her father's loan from the bank and to purchase 2 additional head of cattle. The kitchen garden on her original claim produced abundantly, and she established a practice of putting up preserves and selling the surplus in Caldwell through Mrs. Wellborn's store, which became a consistent small income that she took satisfaction in. Roy's younger brother Franklin did come to visit in the fall of 1879, arriving on the train from Tennessee with a battered leather bag and their father's pocket watch, which he pressed into Roy's hands on the platform at the Caldwell station as a wedding present, 18 months late, and Roy held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment and then put it carefully in his coat pocket. And Hazel saw what it cost him and what it meant to him. And she understood something more about the man she had married. Franklin Cooper was 26 years old, dark like his brother but more openly warm in manner, and he took to the prairie with an enthusiasm that was endearing. He stayed for 3 weeks and spent most of them asking Hazel questions about how she had come to Kansas and what it had been like and how the homesteading worked, with the air of someone filing away information that he intended to use. She liked him immediately and completely. He and Roy fell back into the easy shorthand of brothers without effort, ribbing each other and finishing each other's sentences, and arguing with the comfortable vehemence of people who had been doing it since childhood. On the last night of Franklin's visit, sitting on the porch of what was now Hazel and Roy's house, which still leaned slightly to the left on one end but had been otherwise repaired and expanded to a proper 2-room structure, Franklin said with the directness of the Cooper family, "I think I might come back out here. Permanently, I mean." Roy looked at him. "There's good land still to be claimed northeast of here," he said, "if you're serious about it." "I'm thinking about it seriously," Franklin said. Hazel looked at the two of them in the lamp light. "There would be a spare room here for as long as you needed," she said, "while you got a claim sorted out." Franklin looked at her with Roy's exact steady brown eyes. "Roy always said you had good sense," he said. "He was right," she said simply, and Roy laughed beside her, the full real laugh, and took her hand, and the night was clear and full of stars above them. The spring of 1880 brought 3 things of consequence. The first was the confirmation of what Hazel had begun to suspect in late February, which was that she was expecting a child. she told Roy on an evening in March, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and watched the news move across his face in a wave that began with stillness and ended with something so wholly joyful that she felt it in her chest like sunlight. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and held both her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I've been well for 3 months, actually, but I wanted to be sure before I said anything." He looked at her with that open expression and said, "A baby," as if the word needed testing in his mouth to confirm it was real. "A baby," she agreed. He pressed his forehead briefly to her hands, which was so uncharacteristically unguarded a gesture from this private man that she had to hold herself still again to absorb it. The second thing that spring brought was Franklin Cooper, who had written in February to say he had made up his mind and was coming west to file his own homestead claim, and who arrived in April with considerably more luggage than his first visit and the look of a man who has committed to something and is glad of it. He filed his claim northeast of theirs, as Roy had suggested, and spent the first weeks with them while he established his own place, and the presence of him in the household was, Hazel discovered, a warmth she had not expected. The brothers worked together with an ease and efficiency that was pleasant to be around, and Franklin was good company in the evenings, telling stories about Tennessee with Roy's directness and considerably more theatrical detail. The third thing the spring brought was a dry spell that went on too long and threatened the winter wheat in the North Field. This was the kind of thing that could break a claim, or at least bend it badly, and Hazel and Roy dealt with it with the same combination of practical action and clear-eyed assessment that they brought to everything difficult. They worked the irrigation from the creek, which required several days of hard physical labor to properly channel, and they accepted help from their nearest neighbors, a family named Dobbins who had a claim to the east, and they gave help in return when the Dobbins fence went down in a wind. The wheat survived, diminished but not destroyed, and the summer vegetables saved the margin of the year's accounts. Through the hot months of summer, Hazel worked less physically demanding tasks as the pregnancy advanced, shifting to the garden work and the preserving and the accounts and the business with the store, while Roy and Franklin handled the heavy labor. Roy was attentive without being fussy about it, checking in and asking questions, and accepting her direction on what she needed without requiring her to defend her own understanding of her condition, which she found as endearing as everything else about him. Dr. Fenwick came out to the claim twice in the final months to check on her, and declared her robustly healthy both times with the air of a man who was genuinely pleased to have nothing alarming to report. The baby was born in October of 1880, on an afternoon when the prairie light had that gold clarity that Hazel had come to love above all other lights in the world. Roy was there, and Dr. Fenwick and Mrs. Wellborn, who had appointed herself as additional support staff, and the whole thing was, in the manner of births, simultaneously the most ordinary and the most astonishing thing that had ever happened in that room. The baby was a boy. Roy held him with the care of a man handling the most important thing he had ever been trusted with, and looked at him with an expression that was so transparent it was almost hard to look at directly. "Look at him," Roy said. "I've been looking at him rather a lot," Hazel said from the bed, which made Dr. Fenwick hide a smile behind his hand. "He's got your eyes," Roy said. "He's got your ears," she said. "He'll be fine." They named him Edmund Roy Cooper, Edmund for her father and Roy for his own, and Roy sat beside the bed with the baby in the crook of his arm and Hazel's hand in his other hand, and the lamp burning gold beside them. And the prairie outside was going through its evening colors, rose and gold and the deep transparent blue. And she thought about telegrams arriving on Tuesdays and the particular quality of the Kansas sky from a train window, and a man who had ridden over at a gallop through tornado, whether to make sure she knew where the root cellar was. And she thought that she had come to Kansas expecting wilderness, and had found instead the exact center of her life. Franklin Cooper was an uncle with enormous enthusiasm and only a moderate degree of competence, which was entirely charming. He arrived within the hour of being told and held his nephew with the concentrated attention of someone taking on a significant responsibility, and the baby, who had not yet developed opinions about most things, regarded him with the ancient calm of the newly arrived. "He's a serious one," Franklin said. "He's 4 hours old," Roy said. "I can tell these things," Franklin said. The winter of 1880 was a family winter. The 3 Cooper adults and the baby Edmund and Pearl the border collie, who took one look at the baby and appeared to decide that he was her specific responsibility. The house that Hazel had come to a year and a half ago as a single woman with her father's deed in her hand was fully, thoroughly, and happily occupied, full of the sounds and the warmth and the organized chaos of people who love each other doing the work of living together. She wrote to her Aunt Dorothea every 2 weeks and received in return letters that were increasingly warm and that contained, by December, a suggestion that Dorothea herself might consider coming west more permanently. She was 62 now, she wrote, and Cincinnati was cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather, and the lending library on Elm Street was not sufficient compensation for spending the winters alone in the house on Walnut Street. Hazel wrote back to say that there was a room and that she would be glad to have her, and Roy wrote a separate line at the bottom of the same letter saying the same thing in the direct Cooper manner, and that was that. Dorothea arrived in March of 1881, on the same train line that Hazel had taken 3 years earlier, stepping onto the Caldwell platform with a hat that was entirely too formal for the environment and an expression that was taking everything in with sharp, adjusting intelligence. She looked at Caldwell's Main Street and the flat prairie beyond it and the enormous sky and said, "Well, your father wasn't wrong about the sky." She settled into the spare room with the efficiency of a woman who had organized households for 40 years and adapted to the rhythms of the Cooper homestead with a speed that suggested she had been looking for exactly this kind of purpose for longer than she had admitted. She was excellent with Edmund, who was 5 months old and already developing the focused, attentive expression that looked so much like his father's. She was useful in the house and the garden in ways that were immediate and practical. She argued with Roy about crop rotation techniques with the relish of someone who had finally found an opponent worth arguing with, and Roy argued back with equal relish and obvious affection, and Hazel watched this develop over the spring with the deep satisfaction of someone watching a family become itself. The spring of 1881 brought the welcome news that Franklin's claim had fully come into its own with a good first full wheat crop, and that Franklin himself, who had become a steady and valued member of the Caldwell community, was being noticed by the Dobbins family's eldest daughter, Clara, a sensible and warm-hearted young woman of 22 who shared Franklin's gift for theatrical storytelling and his fundamental seriousness about the things that mattered. Hazel watched this with the specific delight of someone who has found happiness and wishes it actively on the people around them, and said nothing, and watched, and let it unfold in its own time. By summer she was expecting again, and this time she told Roy at the kitchen table on a morning when Edmund was sitting on the floor industriously pulling Pearl's ear, and Pearl was displaying the infinite patience of a dog who understood her vocation. And Roy looked up from his coffee and looked at her for a moment and then smiled the full smile and said, "Good. Good," she agreed. "Good," said Dorothea from the doorway, where she had apparently been standing for the last 30 seconds, because she was a woman who paid attention. The baby, born in January of 1882, was a girl. They named her June, for the month of the yellow wildflowers in the blue pottery mug, and June was, from her first hours, a person with strong opinions about most things and a capacity for expressing them that her father found immediately, completely hilarious. Edmund, who was 15 months old and had recently learned to walk with the specific determined wobble of toddlers who are committed to the concept, but still developing the mechanics, regarded his sister with the exact, focused attention of his father's face, and then patted her head once with his palm, and appeared to decide the matter was settled. Roy Cooper looked at his family assembled in the lamplight of the house on the Kansas prairie, his wife and his children and his aunt by marriage and his dog, and felt something complete about it that he had been building toward for a long time without always knowing precisely what he was building toward. "You know," he said to Hazel that evening, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet with that particular evening quiet that she had come to love, "your father told me once that the land would give you everything you were willing to give it. He said the same thing to me in a letter," she said, "though I think he meant it more broadly than soil." "He was a wise man," Roy said. "He was," she said. "I've been thinking lately that we should put a proper marker on the north field where he planted the first wheat, something with his name on it, something permanent." Roy was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "we should do that." They sat together on the porch, which no longer leaned to the left, Roy having finished the repair on the supports with the thoroughness he brought to all such things, and the January night was cold and clear, and the stars over the prairie were impossibly numerous, and somewhere to the north an owl was making its low repeated sound, and Pearl was lying across both their feet, and the lamp inside the house cast a warm yellow rectangle of light through the window across the porch boards. "Hazel," he said. "Roy," she said. "Are you happy here?" She turned to look at him in the starlight. He was looking at her with that attentive expression, the one that missed nothing, the one that had seen her from the very beginning, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off the train 3 years ago with 2 trunks and no horse, and a deed to 40 acres of prairie, and no idea what she was walking into. "I am profoundly happy here," she said. "I cannot imagine being anywhere else or being anything other than exactly what I am. The land is good and the work is good and the people I love are here." She took his hand and held it. "And I am here with you, which is the part that makes all the rest of it make sense." He held her hand with both of his in the way he did, and looked at her with the full force of everything he was, this man who had built something real from the prairie ground up and had been, without quite knowing it, waiting for her to arrive and complete the picture, and said, "I love you, Hazel Cooper." "I love you, Roy Cooper," she said. "I loved you since before I knew your name, I think. Since the first letter my father wrote me about the neighbor with the good fence and the kind manner and the dog that followed him everywhere." He looked surprised. "He wrote about me. He wrote about you quite a lot," she said. "He said the adjacent claim had a good man on it who had made something worth making and that he hoped someday I would come see it." Roy Cooper was quiet for a moment, and she saw him holding this, the fact of Edmund Gentry's foresight and his affection and his hope, and she saw it settle into him with the weight of something precious. "He never said anything about that to me," Roy said. "He was a subtle man when he wanted to be," she said. "He was a good man," Roy said. "He was," she said. "And he raised me to recognize a good thing when I was looking at it." The night was cold and clear, and the stars were out in their thousands, and the prairie stretched away from them on every side, vast and particular and full of the specific life they had made on it. And Hazel Gentry Cooper sat on her porch with her husband's hands in hers, and felt her father's name in the cold air like a blessing, and thought that the wilderness she had arrived expecting had given way to something far more worth having. Something built from work and honesty and wildflowers in a blue pottery mug, and a man who had put everything in order before she came, as if some part of him had always known she was on her way. She pressed the marker into the north field the following spring, a good stone marker with Edmund Gentry's name and dates cut into it by the stonemason in Caldwell, and she stood at it on a morning in April with Roy beside her and the children at their feet. Edmund, who was now a serious walking, talking person of 2 years with his father's eyes and his grandmother's half-smile, and June, who was 3 months old on Hazel's hip. And they stood together in the field where Edmund Gentry had planted his first winter wheat and looked at the stone in the spring light, and Hazel said, quietly, "I came, Papa, I saw it. You were right about all of it." The wind moved through the new grass around them, and the sky was that April blue, transparent and enormous, and Roy put his arm around her shoulders, and Edmund sat down firmly in the grass and began examining it with the focused intelligence of someone taking inventory. And June blinked her dark eyes at the prairie light and curled her fingers in her mother's hair. They stood there for a while, this family on their combined land, adjacent claims that had become one life, in the particular April light that made everything look like the beginning of something. And then they turned and walked back through the field toward the house, and the house was solid and whole and lit from within, and Dorothea was visible in the window moving around the kitchen, and Pearl came bounding across the yard to meet them, and the prairie went on in all directions beyond them, full and wide and patient and theirs. Franklin Cooper married Clara Dobbins in June of 1882 in the same church where Roy and Hazel had been married 3 years before. The wedding was cheerful and somewhat louder than Roy and Hazel's, owing to Franklin's gift for having a large number of friends and Clara's family being substantial in size and enthusiasm. Hazel stood with Roy at the back of the church with June in her arms and Edmund gripping her skirt, watching Franklin take his vows with the face of a man who has decided something with his whole self and is glad of it, and she thought of her own wedding and the way Roy had looked at her in this same light, and felt the fullness of the life that had grown out of that day. Roy leaned down and said quietly in her ear, "He looks like I felt." "He does," she agreed. The summer of 1882 was the best farming season the Cooper claims had yet produced. The wheat came in full, and the cattle prices were good, and Hazel's preserving business through Wellborn's had grown to the point of being a legitimate supplementary income that Mrs. Wellborn had begun marketing to the hotel in Caldwell as well. Roy bought the additional 20 acres on the northern boundary of the original Gentry claim from a departing homesteader in August, and the combined property was now 100 acres of solid, producing land that both of them knew every inch of the way you know something you have worked and loved for years. They added a room to the house that fall, a proper second bedroom for the children, and Roy and Franklin did the framing together over 2 weekends, while Hazel and Clara and Dorothea worked the kitchen and minded the children and argued with considerable enjoyment about the best method for making pie crust, which was a debate that had begun in August and showed no signs of resolving. Edmund started his schooling in the fall of 1883, riding into Caldwell 3 days a week with his father, and then staying at the Dobbins house until the afternoon when Roy came back through town. His teacher reported to Hazel with an expression of pleased surprise, extraordinarily thorough. He wanted to know not just the answer but all the steps required to arrive at it, which the teacher said was either the mark of a future lawyer or a very demanding engineer. Hazel said she was fairly certain it was his father's influence. Roy said he suspected it was his mother's. June, who was walking at 11 months and talking in full sentences by 18 months, developed early and definitive opinions about most of the organisms in her environment, including Pearl, who she bossed affectionately, and her brother Edmund, whom she followed everywhere and challenged constantly. Roy watched this dynamic with the private amusement of a man who sees his daughter fully and finds the view delightful. Dorothea lived with them until she was 71 years old, when she passed quietly in her sleep on a winter morning in 1890, and was buried in the Caldwell Cemetery with the words from her favorite psalm on the stone. Hazel grieved her with the specific grief of losing someone who has been both family and friend, and was comforted by Roy with the straightforward and complete tenderness that characterized everything he did that mattered, and by her children, who were by then 10 and 8 and understood enough to understand, and by Franklin and Clara, and by the whole community of Caldwell, which had been her community for 12 years now, which had watched her arrive on the train with 2 trunks and no horse, and had been watching her ever since. She stood at the grave in the winter light and said good-bye to her aunt, and thanked her for the borrowed hall in Cincinnati, and the strong coffee and the sharp advice, and the letter that had said, after seeing Roy Cooper for the first time, that a man who put flowers on his table was a man worth knowing. Roy found her at the grave later, after everyone else had gone in from the cold, and stood beside her in the winter quiet without saying anything, because he was a man who understood that some moments did not require words. She took his arm, and they stood there together for a while, and then they walked home through the cold January air to the house where the lamp was lit, and the children were waiting, and the stove was going, and the smell of bread, the sourdough bread she had taught him in the early months of their acquaintance, was moving through the cold air from the kitchen window. The years built on each other in the way that years do when you are paying attention to them. Edmund Cooper grew into a young man of his parents' combined qualities, his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and a capacity for quietly seeing the right thing to do, and then doing it that was, as near as anyone could tell, original to him. June grew into the kind of young woman who could persuade a fence post to reconsider its position, and whose laughter could be heard across the claim, and who had her mother's half-smile and her father's completely unreliable singing voice, which she deployed without apology. Roy and Hazel Cooper were, by 1885, the established center of a homesteading community that had grown and changed around them, some neighbors coming and going, others staying and sinking roots the way the Cooper claims had. They were the people others came to when something needed thinking through, when a hard decision needed made, when the winter was bad and the resources were short, and a person needed to see someone who had weathered the same kind of thing before. They continued to be, through all of it, a couple who worked well together and argued productively, and knew each other's minds with the completeness that only comes from years of genuine attention. They continued to eat supper together on the porch in the summer evenings when the day's work was done, watching the sky go through its colors. Roy continued, long after any practical necessity required it, to put wildflowers in the blue pottery mug when Hazel was coming home from town or from a neighbor's, and she continued to look for his horse on the horizon out of a habit that had become something more than habit, something closer to the specific pleasure of knowing that the best part of your day is on its way. She walked the fence line on their combined claims sometimes in the evenings, from one end of the property to the other and back, the way she had walked it from the beginning, learning the land the way you learn a language you intend to speak for the rest of your life. She knew every corner of it, every low place where water collected in the spring, every rise where the view opened up to the full width of the prairie, and the sky came down to meet it. She knew where the cottonwood tree grew by the creek, and where the first fence had been, and where she had stood in the October light, and told Roy Cooper she was not going back to Cincinnati, and heard him say the 3 words she had been working toward since the second week after her arrival. She had come here for her father's land, not knowing what she was looking for. She had found the land, and she had found something her father had known about before she did, something he had perhaps arranged in the particular quiet way he had of caring for the people he loved. She had found a man who had been building something real in this wide and demanding country, and had been keeping it ready, without knowing precisely for what or for whom, putting things in order with the patience and the care of a man who believed that the world rewarded people who showed up. She had shown up. He had been ready. The land had been between them like a gift from her father, and the life they had built on it was the finest thing she had ever been part of making. The prairie went on around her in the evening light, vast and patient and full, and the grass moved in its long, slow waves, and the sky was enormous and clear, and somewhere ahead on the path home, the lamp was lit in the kitchen window, and there was the sound of her children's voices and her husband's voice and the creak of the porch, and Pearl, who was old now and moved slowly, still waiting by the gate in the evening way she had, and all of it together. The land and the house and the people and the dog and the ordinary, extraordinary, particular life of it was hers, was theirs, was exactly, completely, and permanently enough.